Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Chennai Mukumba, and I am the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Tax Justice Network Africa. I will be your moderator for today's session. So today we will be discussing a briefing paper that has been developed by the Oxfam Pan-African Office, as well as the Development Finance International, entitled Africa's Extreme Inequality Crisis, Building Back Fairer After COVID-19. This paper is based on the Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index, which is a multidimensional index that ranks countries on their policy performance to reduce inequality through public services, progressive taxation, as well as labor rights. The aim of this paper is to advance some of the ongoing debate based on the premise that inequality is not inevitable, but is really a product of policy choice, and that there are clear policy decisions that can be taken in order to reduce inequality. So this report will essentially aim to accelerate and consolidate the work that different regions are already doing or intend to be doing following their regional launches. So as we're going through
déjà réalisé par différemment, donc
crisis. So joining us through the Zoom, please feel free as the conversation goes on to put any questions that you have in the chat. So by way of the program today, we will have some opening remarks. We will then have the presentation of this briefing paper that I've spoken to. We will then have a panel discussion where we are going to have a few experts speak to the findings of this report, and that followed by a question and answer session. So to kick us off today, I'm now going to invite Peter, who is the Pan-Africa Director and Representative to the African Union, Oxfam International. Peter is a Ugandan with 20 years of experience in social justice struggles, development policy analysis, humanitarian planning, and conflict management. Peter also promotes Pan-African narratives and perspectives to development, many of which he has represented in various regional and international fora. So without any further ado, Peter, I'm now going to hand over to you to help open up this meeting and give us a few remarks. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Chennai. Thanks a lot for being here. Greetings from Oxfam friends, and particularly the Pan-African program of the AU Liaison Office for Oxfam. As Chennai has said, my name is Peter. Let me start by joining Chennai also to say good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you are. I really thank you all for taking the time off to participate in this webinar. I really want also to congratulate my colleagues at Oxfam and DFI for all that has gone into a very strong joint Africa brief on trends of inequality in Africa that Matthew Martin, a true friend of Africa of many years, will present to us shortly. I really thank the organizing team from Oxfam Pan-Africa, particularly Lusungu, Victor, Anthony, and many Oxfam colleagues in Washington, DC, led by Nadia, for this and all the engagements around the spring meetings. I think there are a lot of things that are going on, and I really congratulate you all for that. And I really can't thank, on behalf of Oxfam and DFI, the eminent panelists that are here, and the able moderator, Chennai Mukumba, who I think will be introducing the panel anyway. On behalf of us, I just want you to know that we really appreciate and acknowledge the commitment to join and contribute to the discussions. I am very much amazed by the diversity and the spread of the panel, from our allies, Dr. Winfred Masanjala, the Principal Secretary, Minister of Finance and Economic Planning from Malawi, to an old friend, Mira Clara, formerly IMF representative for my country in Uganda, and now also Deputy Division Head for the Africa Department of IMF, to comrades George Odongo, member of the East African Legislative Assembly, Gabriel, and Dr. Shanaz. Thank you all for affording us your valuable time. Friends, we convene to discuss an enduring and in many ways a worsening crisis, inequality in Africa. In previous reports, Oxfam has stated that inequality kills, and it continues to kill people in the continent every day. It's manifesting in increasing conflicts, in climate disasters, in hunger crises such as we are currently confronting in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, floods and storms such as we see in Southern Africa, pandemics such as COVID-19, you can name them. It's manifesting in increasing incidences of domestic violence in households, in mental health challenges, and yes, preventable deaths. It is painful. For us at Oxfam and partners, we believe that addressing inequality is arguably the most urgent action, a form of humanitarian action actually, not only to secure the SDGs, but to actually save millions of lives. This brief we are presenting and discussing today is anchored on the CRI methodology tool that we have developed together with Development Finance International to run countries in the way that Chennai has described. As you'll hear from Dr. Matthew, it paints a disturbing picture. All countries in Africa are dealing with the same poisonous legacy of very high and worsening levels of inequality, a history of colonial expropriation, and failed economic policies, often encouraged by bilateral and multilateral development partners. And more recently, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. The steps that are being taken to tackle the gap between the rich and the poor usually differ from country to country, as the report suggests. Fortunately, there are actually examples that give us hope and shows that it is possible for African governments to choose a path of more equitable growth. It is not all lost. That is part of the evidence we want to share, discuss, and hopefully generate a commitment that as Africa, with the collaboration of international allies, we can address inequality and do so urgently. We can challenge the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the few. We can change the rules on tax to make sure the richest pay their fair share. We can demand more spending on public health, on education, and on social protection. We can demand fair wages for everyone. And we can demand international financing policies that do not worsen, but reduce and end extreme inequality. We can make sure the poorest have a voice, and those voices are heard by those in power. We cannot overemphasize the fact that growing inequality is a result of political choices. African political and business leaders and their development partners face a clear choice. They can choose the path of ever-increasing inequality and poverty and instability, or they can choose another path to a more prosperous, more equal Africa built for the many, not the few. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to what we believe will be a rich and fruitful discussion. Asante sana, and over to you, Comrade Chennai. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks so much for setting the tone for the conversation that we're going to have today. So as I mentioned earlier, before we open up, there are going to be quite a lot of comments that are said in response to the report. And as we go through those, please feel free to use the Q&A section right at the bottom of the screen in order to be able to put any comments or suggestions or questions that you may have that we will respond to later. So without any further ado, I'm now going to introduce Matthew Martin, who will be presenting this briefing paper to us. Matthew Martin is the Director of Development Finance International, which is a nonprofit research, advisory, and capacity building organization. And he has been working there for 25 years to help developing countries mobilize financing to fight poverty and inequality. He has also supported 49 African governments in their efforts to obtain debt relief, negotiate the best quality of official and private external finance, and more recently focused on increasing budget revenue through progressive tax policies. Previously, Matthew worked for Oxford University, the Overseas Development Institute, as well as the World Bank. So Matthew, I'm going to request if you could turn on your camera, and you have about 15 minutes to share with us the findings in the briefing paper. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chennai. And let me thank Peter also for his very generous introduction. The one thing I forgot to put in my bio is that I am African by descent, not just a friend of Africa, but actually a proud African who is in the process of retaking his South African nationality and citizenship. Let me go straight on, having said that, and to the presentation. But while I do that, let me first of all thank all of my colleagues in Oxfam who've been so helpful in preparing this paper together. And also let me thank my colleagues in Development Finance International, David, Maria, Joe, and Emma, who have been behind the scenes producing all the numbers and all the country detailed analysis that underlies this. And let me also say that there are, you can find out a great deal more about all of this on the website for the report and for the whole initiative on fighting inequality across the world, which is www.inequalityindex.org. And there you'll also find detailed profiles of many of the African countries, which make specific policy recommendations for the countries. So having said that, let me move on. If I can get the, just getting the, there we go. Okay, what are the key messages of the report? The key messages are that most African countries, with a few notable exceptions, which I'll highlight during the presentation, were doing poorly in combating inequality before the COVID pandemic hit. And as a result, they were poorly prepared for COVID. That COVID has dramatically worsened poverty and inequality, and the only new measures we can really see that have been taken to stop that have been what we think look like relatively temporary in most countries, health and social protection spending increases. And now, following the end of, or the beginning of the end of the pandemic, since it's not really ending in Africa because people haven't been vaccinated yet, austerity is kicking in hard and debt service is extremely high, and put together those two make it impossible for countries to spend enough to achieve their national development goals and the SDGs. And so we have a series of measures which we recommend that governments, regional organizations, the IMF and the World Bank must take to reverse austerity, cancel debt, and provide a great deal more funding in order to make sure that we can decisively fight inequality and reach the SDGs together. So let's look first of all at Africa's commitment to reducing inequality before COVID. And this is also by way of reminding us why inequality is really important in Africa. Over the last couple of decades, there's been impressive growth and poverty reduction in much of Africa, but there's also been a persistence and in many countries an increase of extreme inequality between the rich and the poor. Africa now contains 30 of the world's 50 most unequal countries and 7 of the top 10. And the SADC community and Central Africa are the world's most unequal sub-regions. You can see in the graph on the left at the bottom that Latin America is still slightly more unequal, has a slightly higher Gini coefficient than Africa as a whole. But in the graph on the right, you can see that SADC and Central Africa have the even higher Gini coefficients. They're the most unequal sub-regions in the world. 6 of the richest Africans now have more wealth than the poorest 50% of the population, than 700 million people. And every African country except Algeria is having its per capita GDP reduced by between 1% and 10% by extreme inequality. Algeria is the only country that has a level of inequality that's unlikely to be reducing its GDP. And in addition to this, we can see across the continent how inequality is exacerbating political instability, insecurity, and migration. So in order to try to measure whether governments are doing anything about this, DFI and Oxfam put together a commitment to reducing inequality index, which measures policies governments are taking to reduce inequality and their impact, ranking 158 governments across the world. And there are 3 pillars, each based on one set of policies which have been shown by a wide range of research to cut inequality sharply. The first pillar is public services, particularly education, health, and social protection. The second is taxation, and the third is policies on labor, particularly women's rights, minimum wages, union rights, and so on. And within each of those pillars, we look at 3 different sets of policies, 3 different sets of indicators. First of all, the policy measures the governments are actually taking. Secondly, how successfully those policies are being implemented. And thirdly, their impact on inequality. And then we combine them all into an overall score for each country. So if we look at Africa's overall score before COVID, we can see in the table at the bottom on the left that North Africa was doing a lot better than the other African regions, and Central Africa was doing worst. But the top score you can get in this index is 1, which shows that you're doing as much as the best countries on every indicator. So you can see that most of the regions could be doing 3 times as much to fight inequality to get a score of 1. In terms of individual countries, South Africa and the Seychelles are among the top 25 global performers, but even the best could do about 1/3 more to match the best global performers. And then at the bottom of the index, we have quite a few African countries, the worst 5 African countries are all in the global bottom 10, and South Sudan, which admittedly is post-conflict, and Nigeria come bottom of the index. How does this then reflect in terms of Africa's public services? Well, Africa's doing relatively little, very little to reduce its inequality via public services. Though Northern and Southern Africa do better than other regions, and SADC middle-income countries are the best performers, led by Namibia and South Africa, which are pumping a lot of money into public services. On the other hand, again, in particular conflict-affected countries, plus Nigeria, are the bottom 5 of the global index, ranked 154th to 158th out of 158. What does this mean in practice? Well, it means that budget allocations to spending are very inadequate in most countries, especially for health and social protection. In the graph at the bottom left of the screen, you can see the targets that Africa has set itself and global initiatives have set Africa for the percentage of their budgets they should be spending on education, health and social protection, and how far Africa is falling short of these. But also the spending is not actually providing enough money to allow the poor to access the services. And you can see that in the bottom right of the screen, where the SDGs have set us all targets for everybody to finish secondary education, for everybody to have healthcare, and for everybody to have access to social protection, and Africa's falling very short. I should just say that the one on the left relating to education is the percentage of the poorest quintile, the poorest 20% of children who are finishing school. And you can see how terribly bad that is, at only 4% of the the poorest children in Africa are actually finishing secondary school. As a result of this, public services in Africa reduce inequality by only about 8%, which is below other developing regions. And yet that there are good performers which show that much more is possible. And they're not just middle-income countries. Namibia, South Africa, and Benin are managing to reduce their inequality by about 20% through public services, whereas Guinea, Nigeria, and South Sudan are doing virtually nothing. We also find in the report that there's a strong link between anti-corruption efforts and inequality reduction. In other words, when the spending actually gets to the people and to the services it's supposed to be funding, then it reduces inequality more effectively. Let's move on to look at tax policies. So Africa does quite a lot better on this. There are 5 African countries in the top 10. Now, this is partly because Africa has pretty, as I'll come on to in more detail in a minute, pretty progressive tax structures on paper, but it's also because they do relatively well at collecting taxes. But obviously they're still quite a lot below 1, so the best score, so they could do much better. And Africa still has the 5 worst performers globally in this pillar, including Mauritius, which does quite well on collecting tax, but actually because it's behaving as a tax haven, we've marked severely down, because that means it's depriving other African countries of their tax revenues. What does this mean in practice? Well, you can see from the graphs at the bottom that Africa has perfectly reasonable, slightly higher than other regions, top personal income tax and corporate income tax rates. It also generally, when applying value-added tax, exempts food, which is the main product that poor people consume. But there are many countries in the region which could do a lot more to increase the rates and to exempt food and so on. And one big hole in Africa is taxes on wealth. There are inheritance, capital gains, and property taxes either missing or very low or not very progressive in many countries across the continent. Sorry, just waiting, yeah. It also means that tax collection is extremely low due to widespread exemptions and tax dodging. And Africa's only collecting about 29% of the taxes it could collect. The best performers in Africa are up at around 2/3 of the taxes they could collect, which is pretty good by international standards. And if you look at wealth tax revenues, they're really tiny, only about 0.3% of GDP, and that's less than half the level of similar countries in Asia or Latin America. Whereas South Africa, the Seychelles, Morocco are collecting 2 to 3% of GDP, about 10 times as much, because they collect their property and financial taxes better. And so as a result of all of this, tax policies are actually likely to be increasing inequality in the region, partly because countries are very dependent on collecting less progressive taxes like VAT and excise duties. On the other hand, where countries really do collect the progressive taxes, like in Tanzania and Tunisia, they are managing to reduce their inequality by 10% through progressive taxation and redistribution. And obviously the low tax collection means that there's much less money around to spend on the crucial things we just discussed in terms of public services. Finally, in terms of labour policies, well, there are two regions, North and Southern Africa, which do moderately well on labour rights. The other three regions, East, Central and West Africa, do very poorly. Again, there are some countries which do very well globally, like the Seychelles and Mauritius. But again, we find that Africa has the 5 lowest countries, including Nigeria as well. So what does that mean in terms of detailed policies on labour? Well, it means that there are very different labour rights across different countries. So I've listed there the various countries that do reasonably well. We look at formal union and labour rights. Some countries do very well, some countries very badly. On women's labour rights, we look at laws on non-discrimination, equal pay, rape and sexual harassment. And some countries do well, but very many lack adequate laws in these areas. And on parental leave, Africa particularly falls behind. So no country meets the ILO standards for the amount of parental leave which is desirable, and Lesotho has none at all. It's interesting that Africa on the whole is actually the best global region on minimum wages. Countries set very high minimum wages compared to their per capita GDP. But Egypt, Ethiopia, South Sudan and Uganda don't have any minimum wage, and Burundi and Rwanda have such old minimum wages that they're worth virtually nothing. And it's important to realize that all of these rights don't apply for the vast majority of Africans. 67% of African workers are either unemployed or in informal or vulnerable employment with no contracts or rights. And that's the highest of any region in the world. And the result of all of this is that wages are extremely unequal. The average wage Gini is 0.65, which is 25% higher than any other developing region. And this level of market inequality is far too high, market-produced inequality is far too high for governments to offset by their tax and spending policies. So much more needs to be done on the labour side. So that was the picture as the CRI has found it just before COVID. And I should say we're going to be doing an update of the global CRI later this year, which will bring the picture up to date for 2022. But let's look at what the impact of COVID and potentially austerity has been too. I think most people in Africa will know that maybe the health impact of COVID has been less bad than in other regions, partly due to early border closures and lockdowns. But when you look at the death rates compared to cases, then you see how high they are compared to other regions because of Africa's poor health system. So if you get sick with COVID, you're more likely to die in Africa than you are in other regions. And of course, the obscene inequality of vaccines continues, so that only 15% of Africa is fully vaccinated today, compared to 74 to 75% in the richest countries. And the economic impact of COVID has been much worse. So 30 million jobs were lost in Africa at the beginning of the pandemic. There are about 40 million Africans being driven into extreme poverty due in part to the lack of social protection. And inequality has been rising sharply because the wealthy have continued to live off the wealth and the earnings they make from their investments, particularly due to rising share prices, and the richest 1% have seen their wealth rise by about 1/3 during the COVID period. And African governments' responses have been as big as they could be, but nevertheless that means small and temporary and inadequate to tackle inequality. So we've seen quite sizable responses, 5.3% of GDP across Africa's emerging markets, which can borrow more on international markets to fund it, only about 3% in low-income countries, but that compares with 19 to 20% in OECD countries. So there's 4 times as much fiscal response to COVID in OECD countries as there is in Africa. And what most of this has been made of large rises in health and social protection spending, but these seem to be being temporary in most countries. Countries also had to borrow in most cases to fund this response, which meant that the recent debt buildup accelerated, and debt service is now averaging 51% of budget revenue, which is 6 times as much as countries are spending on health on average, and 22 times as much as they're spending on social protection. And there've been a lot of noise about debt relief initiatives, including at the recent spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, but unfortunately they're having virtually no impact because they don't include the most important creditors and because they mostly postpone rather than cancelling the debt service. And at the country level, we see very few signs of long-term anti-inequality policies to actually build back fairer. To having tracked across all of the different African countries and their different development programs going forward, we've found efforts at a more progressive tax system only in 5 countries, longer-term social spending rises, building on the health and social protection increases in about 9, and no renewed focus on making services more accessible to the poor or on increasing labour rights. What does the longer-term picture look like? Well, unfortunately, we find a large amount of austerity coming forward. So at least 41% in African countries are planning major cuts in their spending as a percentage of GDP in order to cut their budget deficits and reduce their debt in the absence of debt relief. These figures have been coming down slightly recently because of the extra spending funded by donors on COVID vaccines and oil price rises, which help the oil exporters with their budgets. But these planned cuts could make massive contributions to preserving health and social protection budgets. And of course, more recently, we've seen food price rises due to the Ukraine war, which are adding to import bills and sometimes budget bills where governments pay for food imports. And of course, that's not helped by the fact that the report also discusses that agriculture spend in countries across Africa is only at about less than half the AU target of 10% of the budget, it's 4.6%. In most IMF programs going forward, social spending may be protected from cuts by what are called social spending floors, which stop it from falling. But actually what's needed at this stage is a dramatic increase in spending if Africa's citizens are to have any chance of reaching the SDGs and reducing inequality. And that in turn requires a great deal more tax revenue, obviously, and efforts to collect it better, but also massive debt relief and considerably more aid from the international community. So finally, on to recommendations. As I said already, there are many detailed recommendations for each country available through online profiles at our website. What we say overall is for African governments, each of them needs a comprehensive action plan to reduce inequality. I was working for UNDP over the last few years on trying to work out how much governments needed to fund their SDG plans. And it was quite shocking for me to see that in most countries, there was no concrete plan to achieve any of the goals under SDG 10, which is about reducing inequality, let alone money for it. Secondly, there's a huge opportunity to build on the COVID health and social protection spending increases in order to reach the AU targets and the SDGs, but also we shouldn't forget about the need to raise education spending to offset the schooling losses children have suffered from during COVID. And to fund this and reduce inequality, countries must dramatically increase their collection of progressive taxes by fighting tax dodging and reducing exemptions. And in some cases, they need to make their tax structures more progressive by increasing tax rates. Interestingly, opinion polling across Africa shows that 70% of Africa's citizens want their governments to do this. They want to see the rich paying a fairer share of the burden. At the moment, many rich Africans, as is the case across the world, are paying less of their income in tax than
personnes riches qui paient moins d'impôts en Afrique. Et puis, en fin de compte, il doit y avoir donc une augmentation dramatique en matière des droits du travail.
And extension of rights to informal workers to make sure that 67% of workers who have no
la réalisation des droits. Qu'est-ce que les organisations régionales peuvent faire pour suivre les ODD de la région et peuvent aussi veiller à ce qu'il y ait l'harmonisation de la convergence les systèmes fiscaux en Afrique, peuvent harmoniser les investissements nationaux et les codes fiscaux.
To compliance with all the different AU norms that have been set over the years. And one should be very positive about the fact that Africa has set these norms, because most of the other regions in the world have never actually set these norms. They're just not being respected. So we need more emphasis on implementing. And then finally, they should ensure that convergence objectives on labor reduce inequality and are promoting women's rights, union rights, and minimum wages. And then finally, from the international community, well, the obvious top priority is to make sure that vaccination is speeded up to hasten economic recovery. I think the Global Vaccine Alliance has been saying that we should be getting to 75% of Africa vaccinated by June, and that's certainly something that I'm sure everybody would like to reach. But in the longer term, more importantly, it's really vital to mandate the IMF and the World Bank to put inequality reduction at the center of all of their country programs and their policy advice, and that they should be recommending to countries specific urgent measures to make tax, public services, and labor policies reduce inequality. This is really important in Africa because almost all African countries either have IMF programs or take a very big amount of notice of what the IMF says about their development programs and policies. Secondly, there needs to be a really comprehensive debt cancellation to reduce debt service to very low levels and ensure countries can spend enough to reach the SDGs, especially for the next few years. Thirdly, one could consider issuing more amounts of SDRs. I know all that whole process of issuing SDRs has now got bogged down by all the disagreements within the G20, but it would be great if there could be a lot more SDRs out there which were reallocated to developing countries as grants to spend on the SDGs. There's a real need to focus more on social protection so that all citizens can have social protection by 2030. And the international community could also introduce solidarity taxes in their own countries on wealth and income or financial transactions or carbon emissions, as the French and the Germans have done in different ways, with a proportion of that going to developing countries. So those are the recommendations that we give, and it really is vital that we implement these recommendations going forward, because at the moment, I think people aren't saying it publicly, but if we don't change course very dramatically, not only will Africa continue to have an extreme inequality crisis, which is undermining its growth and development, but we might as well throw the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda into the dustbin. Because at the rate we're going at the moment, there is no way we're going to reach them before about 2050, if then. So sorry to leave you on a negative note. There are lots of positive things, lots of good examples of what African governments are doing in spite of their tight fiscal situations. But overall, the global picture is not great, and much more needs to be done if we're serious about fighting inequality and promoting inclusive development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I think just to pick up from where you left off, absolutely, the picture doesn't look very bright. I think you mentioned quite a few, bleak statistics, but, suffice to say, there's a lot of potential for us to begin to implement policies that can shift the direction, right, that we are currently going. So thank you so much for sort of walking us through that. I do understand that, going through the report, there'll be much more detail, but I think you've been able to give us, a very good overview, and I think leaving us with recommendations, both at national, regional, and international levels, gives us some food for thought in terms of the kind of steps that we need to take at each different levels to change the direction to which we are currently headed. So without any further ado, I'm now going to move into the panel session. So we've got 5 different esteemed panelists who are going to speak to what you've just shared, Matthew. And before I do that, I'm going to quickly introduce them. So first, we have Ms. Clara Mira, who is the Deputy Division Chief and Inequality Network Lead at the IMF African Department, as well as the Mission Chief for Guinea. She previously served as the IMF Resident Representative in Uganda, as the senior economist for Uganda, the EAC and Niger, as well as the advisor to the IMF Executive Director for Spain, Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Venezuela. So Ms. Clara comes with quite an extensive amount of experience. On our panel, we will also have Dr. Winfred Masanjala, who is the Principal Secretary for Economic Planning and Development in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs in the Republic of Malawi. He previously served as the Secretary for Energy from 2012 to 2014, as well as the Director of Economic Affairs in the then Ministry of Finance from 2010 to 2012. Also on our panel, we have Dr. Shanaz Broman, who is a Senior Public Finance Management Specialist at the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative, CABRI. There she leads the Inclusive Budgeting and Financing for Climate Change in Africa program. She also leads the work on developing agriculture value chains. Prior to joining CABRI, she also worked for the federal governments of Ethiopia and Gambia. We also then have on our session, Mr. Gabriel Okowe, Oke Owo, who is the country director at Budget, a civic organization that applies technology to intersect citizen engagement with institutional improvement to facilitate societal change. Gabriel is also a social development professional with over 13 years of progressive experience in the NGO sector and has a background in behavioral science and an advanced degree in project development and implementation. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the panel that we have with us today that are going to help us unpack this brief that Matthew just helped us unpack. So I'm going to begin with Ms. Clara, who I introduced earlier. And so Ms. Clara, I think my first question to you is really going to focus a little bit on the current debt situation, which of course, as Matthew mentioned, is quite severe on the continent. So to address the debt situation as well as reduce the fiscal deficit, the IMF and other international financing institutions are said to be making policy recommendations to governments such as those around austerity, which affects government capacity to provide the essential services that they need to reduce inequality. And this is something that Matthew spoke to quite a bit in his presentation. What would you have to say about that, about the different perceptions that people have that the IMF and other IFIs are essentially leading governments in this direction? So over to you, Ms. Clara.
Thanks so much, Chenai, and thanks so much, Oxfam friends and colleagues for the invitation, for allowing us to be part of this very important event. Thanks also for producing this wonderful index. The report is really interesting. Most of the recommendations, I think, are really shared, and they are very timely and very important. So you, as usual, bring a lot of rigor and a lot of timely analysis to something that we agree that it's very critical. So thank you so much. So maybe let me just start saying that in terms of the context, we fully agree with the assessment of the situation that you provided. So indeed, COVID has exacerbated a situation that was already very concerning, the inequalities across the globe, and poverty has increased very significantly, as you mentioned in the report. No? So we have like 39 million people falling into extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa in 2020 and 2021. So we've seen the increase in inequality, and we are also concerned. We've seen the increase in inequality actually at 3 levels. So the first one is when you look at sub-Saharan Africa and compare to other regions in the world, then within the continent and even within countries in different regions. And of course, this is all showing the slower vaccine rollout that we've discussed, the vaccine inequality, which is very worrisome, even if luckily it's getting a bit better, but there is work to be done. Of course, there is more limited fiscal space and we've talked about that. So the capacity to respond from the continent was more limited, and there are regional disparities also in resilience. So this is the reason why last time in October, when we published our regional economic outlook for sub-Saharan Africa, the title was One Planet, Two Worlds, Three Stories, like saying inequality is going in all directions. And the problem is that when we see that there is a divergent recovery path for Africa, and if this divergent recovery path is going to persist, then this gap between Africa and the rest of the advanced economies is really going to exacerbate. So indeed, the scarring that we see is very worrisome, and the increase in inequality is very important. And we see that the expected growth pace that we see will probably not allow countries to recoup the output losses from the pandemic and reach the sustainable development goals. So it would be very difficult. So yes.
Sorry about that. So we have, just because of limited time, we've got about 3 minutes to respond to each question. So thanks so much for giving that overview. So I think in response to the question, there tends to be this perception that in light of this issue that you've just painted out for us, that the IMF is seemingly sort of promoting austerity. Would you say that that's correct?
Thank you. Sure, I was getting to that.
Okay.
And honestly, what I wanted to say is that we fully agree with the diagnostics, but I don't agree with the characterization of what the IMF is doing. So that is the second part of the question. And why is that? We agree that there are higher spending needs, that there are limited domestic resources, higher debt levels and that external financing conditions have become challenging. So what should countries do, and what are we advising countries to do? Are we telling them implement austerity, as you're saying? No. So what we think is that, in fact, given what we've been doing during the pandemic is massively increase financial assistance through emergency assistance and SDR allocation, etc. So provided financing and appropriately allowed loosening of fiscal deficits and higher debt levels in programs. So saying it's normal, it's okay, there has to be an expansion of the deficits, there has to be, because we are in crisis response mode. But then over the medium term, given the size of the needs and given the availability of financing, our take is that these looser policies cannot really go on forever. So there needs to be some kind of consolidation over the medium term to ensure that there is resilience and that deficits can be financed. So in that context, what the IMF is doing, and maybe I'll just end there, is trying to help countries implement these fiscal consolidations that are needed over the medium term in the less disruptive way. So this is by protecting priority development spending, etc., and providing financing and policy advice. So we think that without such support, the disruption to economic activity and the social implications would be far greater, because the adjustment will have to come one way or another. So in a nutshell, I think the IMF is asking countries to prioritize the protection of the most vulnerable, to calibrate policies, and to protect priority development spending, even within the need to consolidate. So, and of course, we agree there is a need to raise revenue and also to spend better. So we've talked a lot about spending more, and we agree there is a need for spending more, but also to spend better in a more targeted and in a more efficient way. Let me stop here.
Thank you. I know it's such a big question and you have such a short amount of time to put that all in there. But thanks, I think, for that. I suspect that I think where there tends to be a bit of a disconnect is because you've mentioned that at some point, right, there will need to be a certain level of consolidation. It's just at what point, right, should countries begin to implement that? So thank you so much, Clara. I will come back to you with another question. So Dr. Winford, I'd like to turn to you now and pick up again from Matthew's presentation. So Oxfam and DFI argue that inequality, the inequality that we're seeing on the continent, is as a result of policy choices, i.e. it's not inevitable. To what extent do you think that this is true from where you sit as a government official? And what policy choices do you think that African governments need to take or focus on to reduce inequalities? So unfortunately, you also have this 3-minute window, but keen to hear your thoughts on this question. Dr. Winford. I think you are muted at the moment.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, for the question. And let me just congratulate DFI and Oxfam for the study, which touches really on issues that have emerged during our time. So what I wanted to observe is, when you're talking about inequality in Africa, really the inequality that we are looking at now has 2 dimensions. There is a structural dimension, which is long-standing, given the structural drivers of inequality in the region. And then you have the present shock-driven dimensions of inequality. So when we are looking at COVID and building back better and building back fairer, we are now looking at how can African governments deal with the shock dimensions of this. And I think I would concede the point that inequality is indeed a result of policy choices. So if you are looking at the situation that we find ourselves in currently under COVID, and the question then is, how do we build back fairer? When you look back at how different countries have gone through crisis and built back, what you find are 3 elements that seem to come out. Number 1, recoveries are led by public spending. So when you have a situation where economies are going into recessions, in order to get out of a recession, most countries have actually spent their way out of a recession and then been able to use that public spending in order to stimulate markets. The question that we have then is, if we are going to spend out of these crises and yet we have no fiscal headroom, what choices do governments have? And whether spending, in a classical sense, you are looking at spending that's pro-cyclical or anti-cyclical. And this is where the question that you were raising previously, come to be very important because the IMF and the World Bank have a different take on how governments should spend in a difficult situation or in a recession like we are. The second element that comes out from recoveries in the past is that you always have selected and targeted regulation of markets. So that has come out because when you look at the way governments or countries come out of a recession, there's need for government to lead and directing certain investments. Therefore, you look at different regulations. And the third, which now comes to the point that you raised, is that there is deliberate redistributive policies. Governments have decided where to go and how to help the people. So in this case then, you're looking at the traditional redistributive policies that are looking at how to restructure the social inequalities that already exist due to structural inequalities. So issues on spending in education, spending in health, etc., those deal with those structural inequalities. But you also now have to have choices that you make in terms of shock responsive social protection. So where we are now, we are looking at COVID and you're asking, if social protection already exists, are there policies to vertically and horizontally scale up the social protection programs that already exist? And these are the questions that the governments have to ask themselves, and choices have to be made in terms of what interventions can be made to scale up social protection. So in the paper here, they are talking more broadly about labor policies. For me, when I look at a poor country like Malawi, I'm looking specifically at the social protection portfolio. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And I think thank you so much for identifying sort of very clear steps that governments could take, particularly when confronted with situations such as this. So Dr. Shanners, I'm going to point the next question towards you now. So within Africa, there's countries like Namibia, Benin, and South Africa who have significantly reduced inequality by increasing social spending, as was mentioned earlier by Dr. Winford, as well as Matthew, who mentioned that in his presentation. How can African governments ensure that their budgets are effectively addressing social spending, particularly when you think about all of these sort of fiscal spending pressures that they're dealing with? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chennai. Good afternoon, everyone. And let me just start by thanking you for the kind invitation to be part of this panel. And also let me take the opportunity to congratulate Oxfam and Development Finance International on the launch of this report and all the very important work that you do. So on the question, so I think the benefits of social spending in key sectors such as education and health are well known, given their role in human capital development and the role in reducing income inequality and also inequality to opportunity. And many African governments have made international commitments related to social spending, such as the Abuja Declaration on the allocation to health and the Dakar Commitment on Education for All. However, budget allocations in most African countries fall far below these commitments. And one of the problems, of course, is that governments have limited resources available, and most of which are already committed or accounted to due to existing commitments, for instance, salaries or existing capital projects. And this is particularly true now in the post-COVID-19 environment. So as already covered by Matthew in his presentation and Clara, this environment is marked by high debt levels, which have reached or are close to unsustainable levels in many countries. And many governments will therefore be forced to pursue at some point fiscal consolidation or austerity measures. However, even with very little or no fiscal space, governments can take measures to increase social spending. And I'll just give an example. In 2019, we worked with the federal government of Nigeria on tackling the problem of insufficient funding to the health sector, which was leading to poor primary health outcomes. We were working in an environment where the overall federal budget was shrinking due to the poor economic climate. However, the government was able to by reprioritizing health, they were able to increase the allocation to the health sector despite the downward trend in the overall budget. The team also worked on finding ways to improve efficiency in the health sector for better value for money. So I think more countries will be facing similar challenges and trade-offs in the post-COVID-19 environment. And also, just really quickly, I'll just touch on the fact that, there's additional challenges in countries with decentralized systems, as the provision of social services mainly falls under the responsibility of subnational governments. It is therefore important to ensure that budget allocations are being made by sufficient budget allocations are being made by subnational governments, which is not always a straightforward task to do. And it's further complicated by lower levels of capacity and poor data availability. And finally, I just will quickly touch on budget execution, because the budget approved by the legislator is not always the budget spent, which makes it important to ensure that the government actually delivers on what it sets out to do. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shanaz. I know there's a lot to be said on this topic, but thanks for sort of concisely highlighting the big points. And I think for me, what was particularly stand out was this particularly important notion about governments and the way in which they're challenged by some of these decentralized systems, right? And so needing to make sure that even as we're thinking about the spending, the budget allocations to subnational level also needs to be taken into consideration. I'm now going to turn to Mr. Gabriel Okoewo, and I think my question to you highlights is more around the budget revenue and debt part of this conversation. So the CRI report highlights that those African countries that are spending about 51% of their budget revenue on debt are essentially seeing, their essential services negatively affected. How can this debt issue be sorted out, and who has the responsibility? So Matthew gave a few recommendations. What are your thoughts around how African countries can tackle this particularly serious issue that many African countries are facing?
Thank you very much, moderator, and thanks to Oxfam for putting this together and DFI. 51% majority of African countries spending most of their revenue on debt servicing, on debts in general, is the reality that we are dealing with. And in some other countries like Nigeria, to be specific, you will see that it's even far higher than 51% of revenue going into debt servicing. And as much as many of these countries, African countries, are seeing the strong reasons and the opportunity for them to still acquire more debt, the concern is what actually this debt is being used for. Because in a situation where, as we are seeing, more debts are coming, however, we are not seeing increased spending in sectors that shows that we are judiciously using these debts. And what is then going to happen is a situation where the capacity of governments is reduced because they have to service debt. And then, so the big question is about what this debt is being used for. And from the examples, and I think, is it Dr. Winford that also mentioned that there is a need for us to spend when most governments are in recession, government want to spend their way out of recession. Then the question is, what exactly are they spending on? We also then look at the need for us, if we want to spend out of recession, we want to spend on areas that can stimulate economic activities, but not forgetting that there are critical social sectors like the health, like the education, that may not really show direct impact on spending. It may not show to be a manufacturing or an activity that employs people, but these are also critical sectors that help a nation to be healthy, right? And there has been a nexus that has been tied between education and productivity of a nation. Productivity of a nation we automatically lead to increased GDP. Increased GDP will lead to development. Until we're able to see governments in Africa able to acquire debt that they are able to put into a pipeline, right, that allows the nation to build up and improve their productivity, right? We are going to then find ourselves in a situation where more of revenue is going into servicing this debt without us seeing a corresponding productivity or a corresponding results in the welfare or in the livelihood of the people and the nation as a whole. And if I'm just going to pin this down, it is okay to build the road, it is okay to build the bridges and these other hardware infrastructures, but there's the soft, so to say, soft infrastructures are also very important. And I saw Shannon mention with human capacity development, right? And I think this is area where we need to pay our attention to. If we improve human capacity development, overall, we will begin to see a population or a nation that is productive, that are well enough to be able to contribute to economic activity. And this can then generate more income for government, right? Such that as they are paying back debt, as they are servicing debt, they are still able to see growth in the revenue opportunities. They are also able to contribute and reduce the inequality gaps that we are seeing in, the results that Dr. Matthew presented was very glaring and quite unfortunate that we are still operating at those very low and discouraging statistics.
Right. Thank you so much for that. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that, you know what, the debt itself is not the problem, but rather ensuring that it's money that's being spent in the right places that essentially will see a return for that investment. So moving on to the next panelist, I'm really excited. We now have Honorable George Odongo, who's been able to join our session. He wasn't here a bit earlier, but I see he's online. And so I'm going to target the next question towards him, but very quickly before I do so, Honorable George Odongo is a member of Parliament of the East African Legislative Assembly. He serves in the Standing Committee on Communication, Trade and Investment, as well as the Standing Committee on General Purpose. He worked as a public servant in the Office of the President of Uganda for 4 years and in civil society for about 15 years with development agencies, mainly in the areas of governance and public policy advocacy. So Honorable, I'm keen to target my next question towards you. As an entity that engages with a number of states and governments, and so here I'm talking about IELA, where do governments get it right? Or where do they get it wrong? What are some of the opportunities and challenges that governments should be aware of as they're walking, as they walk their populations out of the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19? Really, really keen to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you very much. I also want to join my colleagues in thanking Oxfam for this very, very good report. And we, as members of the EAC, definitely will benefit quite a lot from this report. As the East African community, our work is really basically to coordinate the different partner states. And COVID-19 just exposed the weak underbelly of our regional integration, in the sense that, number one, it exposed the weaknesses in our coordination, particularly our policy coordinations. But the opportunities that we see right now is first looking at the levels of our intra-trade. The EAC's response to poverty is mainly in the area of facilitating trade. And trade is seen as the key driver of our regional integration. We think that our response to issues of poverty, to issues of inequality, are based on our trade strategies. And I think that has come out very clearly during this COVID-19 period. At first, we were pulling in different directions, essentially because COVID took us as a surprise, and many of us did not understand. The different partners were pulling in the different directions because we did not understand what really this COVID was. But soon there was a realization that we have to come together as different partner states. So there has been policy alignment, particularly with respect to facilitating cross-border trade. Even under the COVID situation, the East African Community Partner States adopted a delicate balance between facilitating trade, but also being able to, to protect our people from the virus. But from the EAC perspective, COVID affected mainly the small businesses, the cross-border women businesses, you know, the informal sector, and a big part of the East African community is comprised of the informal sector. And with the pandemic, that really impacted quite a bit. And you can see that the inequalities have found expression in the number of women that lost our businesses, the number of young people that lost our businesses, you know, and as you realize, the East African community has structural issues. They are largely a very young population that majority of whom are living in these in the cities and in the urban areas. So there was need for a policy called the policy response. And this is what the East African community is currently doing, to try and see how do we then, you know, inspire a policy environment in our different partner states that addresses, one, the recovery of these small businesses. As we speak right now, there is a COVID recovery fund that the EAC is coming up with, but also it's being replicated in the different partner states as a means to facilitate, you know, the cheap capital, cheap liquidity for the small businesses to recover from the COVID-19. So there is a lot that we have learned from COVID-19 at the moment, and as partner states, we are grappling with how do we then have policy, you know, coordination, because that has been really the biggest challenge that we as the East African community have. Each partner state has been responding differently, but COVID has pulled the different partner states together to realize we need a common strategy to address the impact of COVID-19. That has to be very specific to the women, to the youth. You know, it has the responses have to be, you know, aligned to the different interest groups that are largely affected by COVID-19.
Right. Thank you so much, Honorable. I think thank you for showing us exactly how it is that member states were able to come together to help address this particular this pandemic, and I think some of the lessons that were learned. So I'm going to now open up the session to Q&A. So if there's anybody who is listening and watching has any questions that they would like to direct towards the audience, please go ahead and do that. Could I make a request that you use the Q&A little tab there, and so we'll essentially be picking questions from there and then targeting them towards panelists, but also perhaps if your question is specifically targeted towards an individual panelist, can you go ahead and indicate that? So I can already see a few of the questions that have propped up. There's one that has come up about the Global Social Protection Fund. Matthew, I'm going to actually come to you about that, but towards the end, just because I think you'd be really great to kind of unpack that particular issue that you had raised. So instead, what I'm going to do is move on to the one about sort of the gender dimension of inequality. So Clara, I have a question that I'm going to ask you, but if you could also include the gender component in responding to this question, that would be great. So I think, as Matthew mentioned earlier, COVID-19 aggravated inequality in Africa, right, in so many different ways, across gender lines, income lines, et cetera, et cetera. But the continent's recovery is being hampered by, you know, various climatic conditions and hunger. You know, Matthew mentioned this already. Are there any sort of inequality reducing technique? Is there any inequality reducing technical and financial support that the IMF is offering African countries right now to support this inclusive recovery and reduction in inequality? Keen to hear your thoughts about this, as well as if you could focus a bit on the gender dimension and responding, that would be really great. Over to you, Clara.
Thanks so much, Chinai. Indeed, the gender dimension is very critical. So we've seen inequality increase, and we've seen gender inequality increase quite significantly. And also as a result of COVID, because COVID has mostly affected the most vulnerable, and this includes, unfortunately, the youth, the informal sector workers. Mostly the informal sector workers are female. So there has been a very important link there to the gender dimension as well. So what is the IMF doing, which was, I think, the question. In general, what we are trying to do first is kind of trying to mitigate the impact of the shock by providing financing. So we've been providing emergency financing, you know, like when we look at the numbers, this is the greatest scale up of resources is 41.1 billion to 48 African countries, reducing public debt service. So we've started through our catastrophe containment and debt relief trust. What we've been doing is provide debt service relief. So trying to provide more space to countries so that they can spend in the policies that are right. Also, there is SDR allocation. So we've talked about the special drawing rights that are providing liquidity to countries. And now we just approved a new instrument called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund. This is a new tool that the IMF is approved in the spring meetings, that it's going to help countries look at longer term challenges. And this includes pandemic preparedness, and it includes resilience, climate change. So in that sense, we think that this is a tool that is going to be very useful for countries to address all these more medium-term and important challenges. And other than that, in particular, we do talk to countries and we do engage with them, for example, on the adequacy and efficiency of social spending. So we think this is very important. As we've been saying, we cannot really reduce social spending at this point. So in terms of the programs that we have normally have floors on social spending, but we also discuss in terms of social safety nets, or for example, when we look at energy reform, what are the distributional implications and how can the poorest be protected from the reforms that are necessary. So, and we've also done work in terms of assessing how much is needed to achieve the SDGs. So that can also provide some guidance in terms of this is where the resources need to be targeted. So generally, we really scale up the focus on inequality, including gender inequality, but including also inequality in the broader sense. And we try to look at all our policies under the lens of what are the distributional implications, and look at these more both in our advice and also in our financing and technical assistance operation.
Great. Thanks so much, Farah. I think thanks so much for outlining, I think, some of the different work that the IMF is doing in this regard. I'm going to, I can see there's another question as well that's focusing a little bit on youth. I'm going to ask Dr. Winford if he could maybe incorporate this in the question that I'd like to ask him next, just around the prospects of achieving, Agenda 2063. This was something that Matthew mentioned as well towards the end of his presentation, right? That it's looking quite bleak that we're going to get there. So, with the current inequality status that's been spoken about, right, and the prospect of achieving Agenda 2063 dimming, what kind of partnerships do you think we need to establish as Africa in order to, rekindle this hope of attaining the SDGs, particularly with Agenda 2063? And the reason I feel that this has a sort of youth component to it, of course, right, is because 2063, the future belongs, to the young population. So what kind of partnerships do we need to be fostering now to create a better future for those who are coming after us, with our sights on 2063? Dr. Winford.
Thank you very much for that question. And I want to agree with you wholeheartedly that indeed the future belongs to the youth. So when you look at the way the economies are going on right now, we have a problem in terms of achieving the SDGs, because much of the investment that was supposed to be made towards achieving the SDGs is no longer happening because we are now in a crisis mode and we're just firefighting. So in looking at this, for me, I thought there are 3 dimensions that we can consider, and I would integrate the youth in these dimensions. The first, in terms of achieving the SDGs, is to actually concede, and this is my view, that the current international global financial architecture was not designed for achieving things like the SDGs. So sometimes we actually talk about the IMF and accuse them of not doing this or that, but I think we must concede they were not designed for this. So maybe the first thing that we can do is look at a global financial architecture that's fit for purpose. What can that be? A global financial architecture that helps us achieve the SDGs, instead of trying to force the current architecture to deliver something for which they were not designed. The second block that I thought we could consider is then inclusive finance. When you're looking at inclusive finance, this is very important for Africa. It matters the two questions that have gone before me. The first one, you need women's economic empowerment. Therefore, you need an inclusive financial system that allows women to access finance and participate in the economy. In the same system, you also need inclusive finance for young people or the youth. I'm saying this because you are now looking at the issue of jobless growth. Even as economies are recovering, the output from the education system is exceeding the capacity of the economies to create jobs. Therefore, most of these youths are ending up in the informal sector. So when you have economies like ours that are dominated by the informal sector, you need to design financial systems that then can help the youth survive and even flourish in the informal sector. So inclusive financial system is very important. And then you have the third dimension where we want to make an argument that we need to look at social policies and social protection as an investment. Mm-hmm. It's not just free money, free this. If you invest in education, 8-12 years from now, you're going to reap the benefits. So some of these investments that we make have short-term outputs. Social policies have long-term outputs and they take a while to manifest themselves, but these are necessary to be had. And therefore, when you look at the youth, you need to make this investment both at the level of education and after they come out of the education system, you also need to make those investments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I think you've hit the nail on the head with your answer to that question. And I think what I'd like to do now is sort of talk to Dr. Shanaz, because you've worked quite extensively with civil society organizations. And I'm keen to hear your thoughts around what role do you think civil society organizations can play, right, in addressing inequality in Africa, particularly, you know, like Dr. Winford mentioned, you know, with the future in mind. What are the functions of civil society today in order to help us address these issues in order to ensure that this doesn't perpetuate into the future? Dr. Shanaz.
Thank you, Chinai. I think civil society organizations have an important role to play. I mean, in addition to the oversight role, which includes holding the government accountable for the implementation of their policies, civil society also has an important role in bringing about policy change by advocating for an increase in social spending in key sectors that are vital for reducing inequality. They also have a role in educating the general public so that they're better able to engage in the budget process and hold the government accountable. However, I mean, in some of our work with civil society organizations, we find that they are, you know, challenges they face that limit their role, you know, such as the lack of formal opportunities to engage in the budget process. And this is particularly true for, you know, civil society organizations who are based in more remote areas. They face capacity constraints, and also the lack of financial resources, which would have, you know, enable them to fully fulfill their function. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that. I think thanks for highlighting the different ways that civil society can contribute to these conversations. So what I want to pivot the conversation a little bit more towards domestic resource mobilization. So there's two questions I want to ask on this. So the first one I'm going to ask to you, Mr. Okoyewo. Matthew mentioned that progressive taxation is particularly important, you know, for us to see how we can, you know, address inequality, particularly looking at, you know, post-tax income where the rich pays more. And I think Matthew highlighted that on the African continent, wealth taxes, for example, are not contributing as much as we need to our treasuries. What do you think governments can do to mobilize domestic revenue much more fairly for the purposes of investing in the essential services that, you know, some of the other speakers have spoken to? And then as soon as you're done, Honorable Odongo, there's a question in the chat that I'm going to ask you to speak to around the way in which governments can address some of the leakages, right, that can occur to domestic resource mobilization. But before we get there, Mr. Okoyewo, keen to hear your thoughts around how we can begin to tax much more progressively.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And I think I'm going to answer that question from one of the recommendations that Matthew presented in the report, though the recommendation was to the international community, and I saw something that was called solidarity tax. And I saw that solidarity tax, I'm looking at solidarity tax from another perspective, to how even in-country governments can use solidarity tax to be able to increase revenue. And I mean, I understand that Matthew can explain that further in another context, but in the context I'm using it to answer this question is, if we're going to get more from revenue, from taxes, progressive taxes, our focus is not just going to be on the so-called rich, because there is still a limiting numbers to the rich. I believe that many African countries have this group of population that are considered the middle class and the lower class. And I believe that if we can inculcate or design a model that sort of encourage, or what we call solidarity tax. And what do I mean? Because that will allow us to be able to have more, people come into the tax nets, and then more people encouraged to pay tax. Right, and then encouraged to pay tax, because the fundamental problem I see is trust deficit, right? In many African countries, there is a high level of trust deficit where the people don't believe that more tax we considerably contribute to better welfare or better development in country. So if we then promote what I pick as solidarity tax, in a situation where everyone that is currently paying tax, there is an incentive system that is created for them that allows, for example, if you are a tax-paying member of the community and you have evidence of your tax payment, there is an incentive package, so to say, that allows you to get certain rebates on when you use public services, when you go to public school, or you use public hospital, or you commit traffic offense and the likes, right? That's in the first place. We begin to build trust for people to know that this tax they are paying is actually paying off for them. They are getting something directly for it. That is on one hand. On the other hand is that it will now encourage more people to come into the tax net, because when they see the incentive that is being made provision for those that are already within the tax net and paying their tax, more people are then encouraged to come into and willingly declare to want to pay tax. And I believe that that can be designed in such a way that it speaks to the rich in the community, and it also addresses the situation of the poor or the middle class, as we may call it. The first thing we need to do is for government to commit to how can they repair the damage that has happened to trust, right, between the government and the people. And when that is one way that can be done is to see how can people that are already paying tax begin to feel proud and feel well rewarded that they are a tax-paying member of the community. That way, they will be more encouraged to do. More people will come into the tax net, and there will be more revenue domestically for government to raise before they can even begin to look into international loans and acquiring more debt.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, because I think you draw attention to really the role of the taxes, contributing to the social contract. So I think the extent to which populations can see their tax tangibly expressed in their environment, I think you start to see that restoration of trust. Honorable Odongo, I mentioned earlier that there was a question that was targeted towards you, still on the same topic of tax. It's a question asking about tax incentives and the way in which that they have been drivers of inequality, particularly in the EAC. And the question is, the EAC came together during the pandemic. Can it come together in the same way and implement a tax incentives policy, one that it developed a couple of years ago? And there's even a call, right? Can you commit to champion this? Keen to hear your thoughts.
Yes, indeed. I think the challenge that we have with our partner states is a near obsession with foreign direct investment. And unfortunately, most of the companies, big corporations, Western capital that invest in our different partner states have found a weakness in our state institutions and our tax policies. They're able to negotiate their way around our weak tax and investment policies. Now, the biggest challenge is to have a competitive investment tax regime in an ESC that is supposed to be a single investment destination. This should be an opportunity for ESC to have a single incentive structure for all the companies, for all the corporations that come to invest in the ESC region. What we see today is competition in terms of investment incentives. And this competition has actually driven partner states into very reckless positions. For example, there are so many incentives that are given to these companies that lead to, first of all, loss of tax revenue. A lot of it has to do with loss of tax revenue. We have also seen, for example, in countries like Uganda, where we do not even have, we don't have minimum wage, essentially because we think that coming up with a minimum wage that would protect, you know, the workers in these different sectors as a way of, you know, sending away potential investors. So the incentive environment, the investment environment has been largely abused. So it's right that the conversations are now about how do we have a regional investment policy that guides the actions of the different partner states, so that we create an investment regime that allows for competition, fair competition, and allows for everybody to pay their fair share of the taxes, and therefore for the partner states to be able to generate tax revenue. So I agree that there is need for us to plug the gaps that are there in our, you know, investment policies. And also you can see that a lot of illicit financial flows, you know, are driven by these, you know, different investment laws, and because we are competitive, the different partner states are competitive, instead of being mutually supportive of each other and seeing that East African community is a single investment destination for the different investors. So the direction should be really, how do we plug into the gap? How does the ESC, and this is the conversation that is going on now, how do we come up with first of all, illicit financial flows, a legal framework to curb illicit financial flows, but also to create investment policies that define the region as a single investment destination.
And then there was a question, the Honorable, do you commit to be the champion for this work?
Yes, already there is a motion that has been sponsored by myself and my colleagues on urging the different partner states to come out with very, very strong legislation on illicit financial flows. Remember that our different partner states are still sovereign partner states. So on matters of domestic revenue collections and matters of investment, they act as sovereign partner states. But the region maintains this superstructure that influences policy decisions in the different partner states, and that's where we come in. So we are trying to sponsor a legislation. You know, first we are starting with putting pressure on our different partner states to come out with progressive laws, one that allow for all these foreign companies, including local companies, to pay taxes.
Right.
Because you see, the current tax regimes, particularly in our different partner states, are so aggressive to the poor. You know, the level of tax compliance, the enforcement of taxes at the lower levels is very high. And yet, you know, we have big companies with a huge opportunity to pay these taxes, and they are shielded by our, you know, investment environment. And it's really driven by vested interests.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's really great to hear about the work that's already happening. I know us at TGNA have also been doing a lot of thinking about this, but it's always really nice to see, you know, our members of parliament pushing for this kind of legislation. So at this point, I'm going to ask the indulgence of the colleagues who are listening into this conversation. We're supposed to wrap up in about 2 minutes, but I want to extend it just by an additional 10 minutes, because I want to hear some final words from each of the panelists in response to what we've discussed already, but I will be quite strict in, asked to keep it, just to about 1 minute. So I'm going to go in the exact same order that we began, and I'm going to start with you, Clara. In fact, there was a question I think that was actually posed that would be great for you to sort of wrap up alongside as well. And so specifically, there's a question around whether or not there's a possibility of the IMF to potentially revise the fiscal consolidation targets to reduce spiraling inequality. So Clara, I want to give you a minute to wrap up, and if you can, maybe speak to some of the different options that the IMF has to addressing inequality.
You won't allow it in 1 minute, but let me try. No, I think honestly, what we've been hearing, and there were so many things that we discussed that I really felt strongly about and that I agreed, like when we discussed about tax incentives and gender. Right. So I think just generally, I think that the challenges are very significant. We didn't talk that much about the impact now of increasing food prices because of the war in Ukraine, which are really going to affect, again, the most vulnerable. So social protection is very, very necessary. Otherwise, inequality, it's also going to continue increasing, and the social implications are going to be terrible. So I think we just need to work all together to respond to the very difficult challenges. There is an important role for countries, as we've been discussing, but also for international organizations, as you've said. So the IMF is really trying to play its part, also engaging more with others that have more technical knowledge, for example, on labor issues like the ILO or the World Food Program, the World Bank, etc. So kind of trying to work all together, mainstream really inequality, take into account inequality in everything we do, in the lending that we provide, in the advice that we provide, and building capacity. So I think this is all really necessary. The situation for every country gets assessed as time goes by to try to provide advice that it's targeted and that it's relevant, and that depends on the situation of each specific country. So it's difficult to generalize, but generally what we are saying is focus on the most vulnerable and also protect priority spending. So fully agreed that health, education, social protection should really be protected at all costs because of the implications that they have for inequality.
Okay.
Okay,
perfect. Thank you so much, Clara. Dr. Winford, keen to hear your final thoughts as well.
Thank you very much. I think I want to finish by making an observation, I think in the lines of Francois Bourguignon's poverty, inequality, and growth triangle. We must concede that the growth that we can get has less effect on poverty reduction to the extent that inequality is increasing. Therefore, investing in policies that reduce inequality is good for poverty reduction. And in turn, it's also good, again, cyclically, in terms of growth. Therefore, focusing on poverty reduction without measures that reduce inequality does not achieve much. Whereas if you focus on inequality reduction, that helps even in poverty reduction, and then the growth effects, the poverty reduction effects of growth are actually enhanced by looking at inequality reduction. So social policies that go that far are actually very useful and a good investment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Menez. Winfred, Shanaz, any last thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Just to say that I do broadly agree with the recommendations in the report. And again, I commend, the two organizations for it. But I'd also just like to stress that, Africa is vulnerable to climate change, given the region's reliance on traditional rain-fed agriculture and resource-intensive sectors. And unfortunately, the climate crisis is expected to negatively affect the most vulnerable women and men, and increase inequality, including gender inequality. So urgent adaptation is therefore needed to increase the resilience of communities. And as we see, governments across the region are already taking steps to, integrate climate change into their planning and budgeting processes. However, more will be needed with more ambitious climate policies and reforms in the coming years. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shanaz. Thanks so much for those thoughts. I'm going to go over to Gabriel. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, a very great session. I'm going to round up still talking about debt. And one of the recommendations I saw in the report about debt forgiveness or debt cancellation. And as much as that is good, I mean, that is something that we should advocate for if it is possible. I'm going to ask that in our advocacy, it should be that it is not just a blanket debt forgiveness, but it should be tied to certain accountability measures or special program as such that it is not, we should not advocate for a debt forgiveness that just write off debt, but it should be a debt forgiveness that plows back what should be used to service certain debt. The government of nations should be mandated to plow it back into a special program that addresses, that speak directly to social protection or essential services. That way, right, and it should be conditional such that what you are meant to pay back this year, if you are able to use it judiciously and you can show us evidence, accountability and transparency process that was built into that, we are going to be able to then make you write off the next one, or you will be qualified to also use the next one for such a program also. It should be that way because really historically, debt forgiveness have not really contributed to improving life in the life and welfare of the people. So if it will happen this time around, it should happen in a very innovative way that can speak to the life and development of the people. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Gabriel. I think thanks for reminding us that even as we talk about cancelling debt, we also need to be thinking about where we would be reinvesting that. Honorable Odongo, I'm going to come to you and ask you for some of your final thoughts as well.
Thank you very much. You know, for regional integration to be a strategy for policy for poverty reduction, it has to be built around strong domestic policies, but also the alignment of the different policies that are responsive, you know, to the ordinary citizen of East Africa, facilitate small businesses to grow. And I think that is where we should be going, because, you know, we need to spur the growth of small business as the foundation for, you know, for fighting poverty. And as a community, we need to try and see how do we need to do a policy audit in the different partner states to see what has worked, what is not working, so that we can pool our resources together, put in place a very good infrastructure in place. Already the East African community is investing a lot of money on very hard infrastructure. We're putting in roads, investing on power. You know, all these can only work in an environment where the ordinary citizen is contributing to it, where we have policies that try to empower the ordinary citizen. So we want to see where we're having the different partner states putting their tax revenue on human capital development, putting in place, their revenue collection on health and education. Because these are the equalizers. These are the things that will make the community much stronger. And as much as we are trying to attract huge investments from foreign capital investment, we also must look at the trickle-down effect of this and facilitate the growth of these small businesses as a foundation for growing, for fighting poverty. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for those thoughts. Matthew, I'm going to hand over to you. So there was a specific Global Social Protection Fund question, but I mean, I'm keen to just hear your thoughts as well. I think a lot has been said in response to your presentation. So in a minute or so, you know, keen to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's been an incredibly rich discussion, which I can't possibly respond to in a minute. But on the Global Social Protection Fund, it's a massive global initiative supported by a huge number of people. I'm sure if you Google it, you can find out all the supporters and what the content is. But the essential idea is that everybody should have access to social protection, which, as Clara just pointed out, and other colleagues, Shaz just pointed out, is going to become even more vital in the context of rising food prices, climate change, and so on. Just to respond to one other question, which came up, which was about gender and how it's included in the CRI. There's a lot of gender in the CRI, particularly in the labour pillar. But it's also true to say that there's a huge gap in data on gender worldwide. So, for example, UN Women tries to assess whether governments look in their budgets at whether the money is getting to women or not. And they found that only 4 countries in Africa actually have in place a decent system for doing that on the spending side. We also plan, there was a question about disability, to expand in future issues about labor rights and so on, to cover, and our issues about social protection, to cover whether those are being given to other groups which are typically discriminated against through disability, through race, through age, through sexuality, and so on. So we will be trying to do that over the years. But the fundamental point I just want to end with, you know, I totally take the point from Clara that the IMF doesn't necessarily arrive in a country going, we must have austerity, whatever. They look at how much money is available. And the fact is that in the last 5 years, since or before COVID arrived, but after 2015, the rest of the world looked at Africa and said, you know, you're on your own. Go to the private markets. We won't have very much aid for you. Raise your tax revenue and go to the private markets. And aid has gone up a bit, but nothing like as fast as it did in the say the period 2010 to 2015, and very much down in terms of Africa's proportion of Africa's GDP. And what African governments then did was they went to the markets and they got money which was much more expensive and which they couldn't afford. And now they're in a debt crisis again. It's vital that we have debt relief. It's vital that we have debt relief, which is accountable. When it was accountable under the HIPC initiative, it did actually result in a big increase in education and health spending and allowed a lot of countries to reach universal primary education, increase universal healthcare dramatically. So that can be done. But fundamentally, one of the colleagues said about looking at investment, fighting inequality is the best investment African governments can make for their future growth. Even the IMF has done studies showing that you could increase per capita GDP by between 1% and 10% in different African countries if you fought inequality successfully. And it also, as Oxfam has shown in the wonderful report that was done earlier this year called Inequality Kills, it saves lives. If people think that it's not an urgent issue, there are millions of people dying every year in Africa because of inequality. And we have to stop that happening. It's even more urgent, I think, than climate change. Of course, the two go together because climate change will exacerbate inequality. But we really have got to get to the stage. And I see that frustration in the speeches of the IMF Managing Director, the UN Secretary General, the World Bank President, that essentially the leaders of the world are not in the same place that they were back in 2010 when they all met and agreed to increase all the efforts to fund global development. They're too busy fighting with one another and not necessarily thinking about increasing money. Now, we have seen a big increase in support for COVID, but they really need to think beyond COVID. Otherwise, in 5 years or 10 years, when the next pandemic comes along, we'll all be in the same mess and going backwards in terms of global development. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Matthew. And I think thanks so much for responding to some of the questions as well as tying some of what was said together. I think from my perspective, a huge thank you to the panel, I think, to respond to all of these really important questions that came up. And Matthew, thanks so much for that presentation. I think, you know, in summary, what really came out quite strikingly is that we are in a position that is quite bleak, but the future doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And there's a number of different decisions we can be taking as African countries in order to address that. And I think the first, Matthew, that you spoke to was essentially investing in our public services. And, you know, you rightly mentioned, Dr. Winford said, you know, the best way to invest in our future is by investing in some of these public services. Right now, the amount we're investing in education, health, and social protection isn't where it should be, and we definitely need to ramp that up. We also need to see the extent to which we can better make use of our tax policies. I think we heard from Honorable Odongo that there is currently a competition between countries, you know, that are trying to attract foreign direct investment, but it, in a sense, really cuts African countries at the knees. I think it is interesting for me because, Matthew, I think one of the points that didn't get a lot of attention was this point around labor policies that you spoke to. You mentioned in your presentation that the African continent is really, you know, doing one of the worst comparatively, and it is something that we need to look into, particularly if we're trying to find more sustainable ways to address this issue of inequality. And I think to wrap up, as you mentioned, you know, the COVID pandemic pandemic has happened, but we can almost be assured that there are future situations that are going to shock the continent that will come in, in the next few years, and we need to position ourselves to be able to mitigate those negative impacts. And we've already seen that now, for example, with the Ukraine war, that is already having implications on the continent when you're looking at energy prices and food prices. So we do need to position ourselves better to be able to address some of these issues that are going to continue to come in the future. So on that note, I just really want to thank all of the different panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this session. We really appreciate you taking the opportunity to read the report and then speak to it. Nanzala has just put a link to the report in the chat. So if you do want to read that, please go ahead and do so. Matthew, thank you so much for the presentation that you essentially shared. A huge thank you to Oxfam and DFI for doing that research, and really looking forward to seeing how that can be used as a tool, right, to affect policy in the future. And a huge thank you to the Oxfam team, particularly those who are in the background for all of the work that you did in organizing this. I don't know, Lusunga, would you like perhaps for everybody to turn on the videos? Maybe we can have an opportunity for a quick photo, just for documentation purposes. And then I think happy to wrap that up. So can I just ask a few, I think Shanaz, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera, Winford as well. That would be fantastic. I think Peter has dropped, but that's not a problem. Oh, there's Peter, there you are. And I think that's it. And a huge thank you as well to everybody who joined to listen to this conversation. We appreciate you taking the time. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.